Who killed Frank Grimes? No, I don't mean literally. We all know that Grimes had a breakdown and touched those electrical lines. There's no conspiracy there. I'm sure the Springfield coroner looked at this case and quickly determined it was an accident. But whose fault was Frank Grimes' death? At least according to the narrative. There have been so many essays about this episode, both in written and video forms, about what should be our main takeaway from this tragedy. Did capitalism and the cult of work kill Frank Grimes? Was it an obsession with fairness and equity? Did The Simpsons' pro-Homer status quo kill him? Today, let's look at the characters of Homer's enemy and figure out who or what pushed Grimy over the edge. There are 17 named Simpsons characters in Homer's enemy, 18 if we count Chief Wiggum in the crowd. But we can discard most of them immediately, as there is only a handful that interact with Grimes in a meaningful way. For example, Marge and Moe both give Homer advice that moves things along and escalates the bad blood. But I don't think we can reasonably blame this breakdown on Moe's enemies list. Same with Bart owning a factory. The only ancillary character we could possibly blame is Kent Brockman, as it was his Kent's People segment that causes the whole episode to happen. If Burns doesn't see this, Grimy probably dies in some other random accident instead. Kent Brockman is the butterfly effect guy in the story. Still, while he is the inciting incident, no one's gonna argue that the message of this episode has anything to do with him. If you want to watch something about the evil media, go watch Homer Badman. No, this is a power plant episode. If someone caused Frank Grimes' death, it's gonna be someone at that plant. It's gonna be either Homer, Burns, Lenny and Carl, or Grimy himself. And what better place to start than the top? First, let's consider Mr. Burns' role in Homer's enemy. The old capitalism killed Frank Grimes argument, a classic. Mr. Burns has always represented the ultra-rich ruling class, someone who can snap his fingers and make the Simpsons' lives a living hell. The same could be said for any of his employees at any time. Mr. Burns holds all the power. There are indeed moments that satirize the class differences at play. Right from the get-go, Grimes' backstory includes delivering gifts to more fortunate children. Mr. Burns hypocritically describes Grimes as a self-made man, just like himself. They never show Burns actually working, instead watching TV in his office or taking his vice president for a walk. At the contest, he proclaims, "And the bold new ideas these tiny tykes unveil for us today could make thousands of jobs like yours obsolete." Heck, we could argue that Bart's B-plot adds to this theme about management and the working man. Bart, like Mr. Burns, puts Milhouse to work in his factory. Milhouse is just like the put-upon Frank Grimes in some respects. If you want to view Homer's enemy as the result of Mr. Burns facilitating an unjust system, the themes are certainly present. On the other hand, this is not the vengeful penny-pinching Mr. Burns from Last Exit to Springfield. He is much more checked out and indifferent in this episode. If Homer's enemy is a criticism of capitalism, then why isn't Mr. Burns acting like a traditional capitalist? This is a guy who hires a dog as executive vice president. He continues employing Homer, despite the clear pattern of costly accidents and meltdowns. He rejects Martin's groundbreaking power plant model because it has no heart, and then declares Homer the winner for some reason. In some ways, I think Mr. Burns' portrayal in this episode is even more insidious and cynical than something like Last Exit to Springfield. That he's not the mustache-twirling CEO, pitting his employees against each other as a distraction. This episode portrays Burns as enjoying the rewards of his position despite his terrible management decisions. He is set up so well that it doesn't even matter if he rewards an idiot like Homer Simpson. Burns is incompetent, and he still doesn't fail. If that's not a condemnation of our system, I don't know what is. It's not just that Mr. Burns is a crappy boss that pushes Grimes over the edge. He had been crappy twice to him already, and Grimes is used to the world dumping on him. It's that Burns is both crappy and an idiot that breaks his brain. I think there's a legitimate argument that Frank Grimes' death should fall at Burns' door. Mr. Burns totally shattered his worldview, making him confront the bitter idea that maybe no one will reward his hard work. Mr. Burns is the gatekeeper after all. What are we gonna do? Blame Lenny and Carl for his downfall? Well, now that you mention it... Huh? How can our dear Lenny and Carl be at fault for any death on The Simpsons? Lenny and Carl are national treasures, these inoffensive and lovable members of our Greek chorus. They are designed to facilitate the story, not drive it. However, what makes Homer's Enemy special is the way that these kinds of supporting characters fuel the madness. Perhaps Grimes's was a death by casual indifference. Let's look at what Lenny and Carl do throughout Homer's Enemy. First, Lenny introduces himself, and Carl and Homer and himself. They comment about their own degrees in nuclear physics and casually laugh about Homer never getting one. Then they shrug and walk away at Grimes' notion that they have work to do. They seem unfazed by Homer's duck-like eating. Lenny argues, he had 3 beers at lunch, that would make anyone sleepy. And Carl says, it's best not to think about it. Later, when Grimes complains about Homer, Carl turns it around and asks what his big problem with him is. They defend him, saying everyone makes mistakes and that Homer is okay and to give him a break. During the contest, they repeatedly shush Grimes' outbursts and celebrate Homer's contest win. Lenny and Carl are important characters in Homer's Enemy in that they are Grimes' key sounding boards regarding his concerns. From Grimes' point of view, they should be allies, regular working Joes who earn their nuclear physics degrees. Mr. Burns is in management, so it's possible he might not know what's really going on. The episode makes it abundantly clear that Lenny and Carl are totally aware of Homer's failings, even his extremely dangerous ones, and they don't care. They may even be enabling Homer's behavior. For someone like Grimes, this is an even bigger betrayal than someone like Mr. Burns. Grimes practically expects to be kicked around by Burns. He has been conditioned to feel this way. Why should Mr. Burns awarding Homer first prize be what pushes him over the edge? No, it's the thunderous applause that does him in. It's not that the system itself is stupid and incompetent. It's that the Lenny and Carls of the world celebrate it and encourage him to be just like them. They're like zombies. Even when Grimes is about to touch the electrical wires, they can't be bothered to stop him. The episode makes it clear that Lenny and Carl don't give a shit about any of this. They are in a zen-like state of contentment about their jobs and their friendship with Homer. They don't understand what the big deal is. Frank Grimes realizes he is utterly alone in his thinking, and that's what breaks him. It was Lenny and Carl's casual and easygoing indifference. If you're really into the whole evil happens when good men do nothing thing, I can see this angle appealing to you. Of course, that raises the question of how evil Homer Simpson really is. I'm gonna be upfront about this one. I don't really buy the Homer Simpson theory. I have never understood the fan argument that Homer's Enemy was a precursor to all that jerk-ass Homer stuff. It's certainly true that this episode does not hold back about Homer's flaws as a character. If we want to talk about people not giving a shit, well, let's just look at the whole first half of Homer's Enemy. Homer has no regard for Grimes' personal property, and, as usual, cares nothing about nuclear power plant safety. This isn't Homer slacking off while working at the bowling alley. Homer doing a bad job could kill people. I am of the firm belief that the only reason Homer's Enemy works is because Homer is a giant teddy bear throughout the second half of it. You notice, after this scene, they totally back off of the more inconsiderate aspect of Homer's personality. They present it as Homer being oblivious and shocked by Frank declaring him his enemy, and actively works to win him over. He actually takes Marge's criticisms about his professionalism to heart and becomes less annoying to his coworker. We stop getting these kinds of moments. He just doesn't understand that Grimes is equally disgusted by his incompetence. The audience has accepted Homer's incompetence for the previous 7 seasons. So, while it makes Grimes a great comedic foil for pointing it out, the problem isn't going to land with us, especially when we are shown no negative consequences. If this were a reality show, Homer is getting what is called the winner's edit. I mean, Homer is literally the only guy who asks Grimes if he's okay during his breakdown. If that doesn't give away who we're meant to root for, I don't know what would. This is not the story of Homer being a jerkass who tortures his hardworking coworker for all 22 minutes. No one would want to watch that episode. This is the story of an incompetent teddy bear's success driving Grimes insane. We could argue, of course, this is Homer's fault because his stupidity is the catalyst. But this scene makes it clear that the world's reaction is the tipping point, if we're going to blame anyone for Grimes' death. Then again, maybe we shouldn't be blaming anyone else. So far, you've heard 3 different explanations for what really caused Frank Grimes' death. But have we considered that, quite possibly, Frank Grimes is just an asshole, and he brought his death upon himself? If Frank Grimes is a champion of hard work and rugged individualism, then how can his death be the fault of anyone else? Sure, Homer's enemy gives Grimey a platform to air his grievances about Homer. We get that iconic speech at the Simpsons' house, after all. And the text of the episode supports that thesis, at least when it comes to Homer. Bart literally agrees with Grimes to underline this scene. It's easy to consider writer John Swartzwelder's libertarian politics and come to the conclusion that this is the episode's point of view. But just because Grimes is quote-unquote right about Homer coasting through life doesn't mean he's not an asshole. Just look at how the two of them react to their big blow-up. Homer sulks and makes an effort to turn over a new leaf, while Grimes whines and enacts a scheme to humiliate him. Look at him, he's cackling in the window like a Disney villain. The obvious conclusion is that Frank Grimes is wrong for taking out his frustrations on Homer. Yeah, he's right to call him out about the pencils and the lunch earlier, but his beef is really with Mr. Burns in terms of how he's been treated. Frank Grimes is the perfect example of how people without power will often blame and demonize other people without power. The folks who didn't directly cause your unfair situation. Maybe if Grimes can tear Homer down, Burns will magically stop being a terrible boss. Maybe the whole world will stop tearing him down. Hey, it's worth a shot, right? The world turned Grimes into a bitter and envious little man, and that's what did him in. He couldn't let go of his Homer obsession, refused to become a nameless background character, and paid the price for it. Wow, it's almost like Grimes suddenly realized he was a character on a TV show. In a 2021 interview with The New Yorker, John Swartzwelder said this about Homer's enemy. Grimey was asking for it the whole episode. He didn't approve of our Homer. He was asking for it, and he got it. Not exactly an endorsement of Frank Grimes as the hardworking ideal, huh? But this is the most interesting part of his answer. He didn't approve of our Homer. Perhaps we read into the satirical elements of Homer's enemy too much, and get too hung up on any sociological parallels. Perhaps Homer's enemy is almost entirely a meta-episode, and the only point really being made is about The Simpsons. The whole thing is full of nonsensical moments that don't quite resemble our real world. When Homer dumps a bucket of water on his console, nothing bad happens. When the danger light is going off, nothing happens. At least not that we see. A capitalist like Mr. Burns probably would eventually realize that Homer is affecting his bottom line. Sure, Homer's enemy is full of down-to-earth observational charm, typical of this era, but every step of the way, they underline how utterly absurd Homer Simpson's situation is. It's a fantasy. Josh Weinstein has stated the initial premise was, what if a guy from the real world had to deal with Homer Simpson? So Grimes had to be destroyed. He didn't approve of our Homer. It's as simple as that. Frank Grimes hates the fantasy world of the television show The Simpsons, and unfortunately for him, that's where he lives. The rules of this world are applied differently to Homer. Sorry buddy, them's the breaks. Frank Grimes was killed by The Simpsons' unflinching status quo. Now, of course, I would see it that way. I'm a Simpsons YouTuber. If I had it my way, every episode is secretly about The Simpsons. But I think that's fundamentally the genius of Homer's Enemy as an episode. That it's written open-endedly enough that it almost expects the audience to latch onto different elements of it. Inequity, the American dream, groupthink, nuclear safety, The Simpsons meta. It touches on these subjects just enough to invite discussion, while never dominating the episode or providing the easy answers. You can be like, hey, maybe Grimes' death was caused by Mr. Burns. Maybe Lenny and Carl do enable Homer to a dangerous degree. But you can also step back and think, maybe those arguments are total bullshit. No one forced the down-on-his-luck Grimes to fixate so much on Homer. I love that such a heady meta episode of The Simpsons has this beautifully simple and elegant character conflict to it. It's practically a story of two schoolchildren. Homer keeps bothering Frank while he's doing his schoolwork. Frank thinks Homer is stupid and lazy. Teacher is asleep at the wheel. It dangles these big important concepts in the audience's eyes, but it's this petty personal angle that drives the narrative. It's perfectly executed. Everyone knows why Frank Grimes died and how much his obsession with Homer ultimately broke him. As a cautionary tale, that aspect of the story is very clear. But as for who deserves most of the blame, well, you can form your own conclusion. Me, I'm just gonna blame Kent Brockman.